Can you hear me better? Yes. Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Really very lucky to have you join us, Sarah. Thank you for making the trek today. So we're going to start with some housekeeping that Martin asked me to recall. One is the bathrooms are to the right as you leave the building if needed, or as you leave the room, the library if needed. And the fire exit, should a fire alarm go off, we would leave and meet up at All Saints Park, where we will count heads and make sure nobody is still in the blaze. So those are the things we're required to mention. And lastly, if you haven't picked it up yet, this lovely, Sarah and I were just admiring the design on the program and the pages for that. Do please pick up the Manchester Poetry Library program. A lot of work goes into it. Martin Kratz here, Becky Swain, and others build a really, really fantastic list of events. So highly encourage you to pick up one and come to some other events. So this new book by Sarah Howe, I have to say, looking at the reviews, a lot of it has been worth the wait. A lot of that kind of language, which must be, I don't know, interesting to kind of muscle through. But it has been an absolutely highly anticipated book. I remember 3 years ago when Sarah Howe first joined us as a guest on the MA Publishing, there was a lot of talk already about the collection, and it's really excited to see it in print now. So born in Hong Kong to an English father and a Chinese mother, Sarah Howe moved to England as a child. Her pamphlet, A Certain Chinese Encyclopedia, won an Eric Gregory Award, and her first collection, Loop of Jade, won the T.S. Eliot Prize and the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, and was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. And those of you probably know that as well, that Loop of Jade was the first T.S. Eliot Award to a debut author. Her most recent collection, again, 4 tokens, moves through migration and colonial archives as lived inheritance. A mother's story, a daughter's listening, a body that remembers in its own peculiar alphabet. Poem structures borrow the twist of DNA. Objects, porcelain, postcards, museum labels speak back as witnesses. And I'm very excited to hear some selections from it read tonight. So Sarah's joining us as our first guest on Poets Who Edit, which is a new reading series sponsored by the Poetry Research Group here at MMU, and as well as the MA Publishing program. And it invites award-winning poets who are also editors at influential presses from across the UK's diverse publishing scene. Joining us in a month's time will be Rachel Allen from Fitzcarraldo Editions as well, so we have a lovely lineup. But thank you, and please join me in welcoming Sarah Howe.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you all of you for braving the rain to be here this afternoon. I'll start with a poem that's a sort of lament for the Cantonese, which my mum didn't really pass down to me, so a language that's been something of a ghost to me through my life, one that I had the baby stirrings of, but then rapidly lost when my family moved to England from Hong Kong when I was 7. Undersong 3. No, I do not speak my mother's language. Other tongue, nether tongue, long gone birthright tongue, mutter tongue, untuned, unstrung. 2 sang in my child's ear, one sense, the other a kawan of tones and underlonging, unbelonging. I do not my unknown language, harder one with age, sing wrong burdened tongue, oh mend my dead end tongue. I do not own my mother's tongue, I ring alone my father language, loaned tongue, a loaned song, gauge my ears gauge hamstrung, my further tongue, falter tongue, I hone a never gone, a not undone. As Brian was tactfully hinting to, this book took a long time to write. With my editor hat on, I would not necessarily advise any of my poets to leave a 10-year gap between books, but you do what you can, I suppose. And I like to blame my children for it taking such a long time, which might be rather unfair. So I'll read a couple of poems for my son, who's quite small in these. He's 8 now, which I guess marks that span of time and living. So much happened in the lived experience of writing this book. But I find memory is a funny thing. When I read this poem, I now can't really remember the original scene or happening anymore. Like the poem has become a parasite that's sort of displaced the actual memory. It's a book that's very much preoccupied with remembering and its unreliabilities and puzzles. Sometimes I think of the conkers I gathered once when small myself, shucked of their green armour and placed in the glass bowl with the silvered rim to admire their mahogany sheen. Why am I driving the train off the rails? 2 nights ago, my son woke at 4 a.m, crying for me in the dark. I placed my cool hand on his forehead, licked with winter clamminess. He said, "I had a bad dream." Softly, eyes tight shut, like something heard in a story. To my knowledge, his first, a concept I'd thought he hadn't yet met in his slender frame of human experience. The CD spinning leisurely in the neighbour's ruined magnolia glints its ambit of tapering sun. As I kissed his hair, I had a vision of his little head as a nut or hollow shell. A day or so later, the conkers issued a plague of white wriggling worms from their seemingly impermeable, glossy surfaces. Next morning, over rice pops, I asked him what he had dreamed. I listened like a mother in a story, like listening could make it right. And this next one is also about my son. When he was 2, there was a stretch of time when he muddled up you and I. I suppose the more common one is children referring to themselves in the third person by their name when they're coming into language. But this one was rather more worrying and more delightful because of the utter confusion it seemed to instill in the rest of us. It sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that we would call him you, so he was you, and we would call ourselves I, so everyone else was I. A working title for this book was Babel's Drift, which in situ, in the poem it comes from, is a metaphor for the scramblings of genetic code from generation to generation. But I guess I also wanted to use this space of the book to think about Babel and humans coming into language and the sort of felicitous accidents therein. This is a sonnet, but the kind of sonnet that rhymes me and time. And it also has some astronomy in it, because I find it hard to do anything without astronomy in it sometimes. Parallax, after Neruda Sonnet 17. For a few months around 2.5, you mixed up you and I. Poems, of course, do it all the time. I'd say, "Wait, you need your hat." And you took that you as a fixed star to navigate by, not knowing yet how stars, according to the position of the viewer, shift in the sky. It would take me a moment to adjust, and your face in that glitch of light delay took on the disconcerting air of telepath or scryer deep into my heart, young and ancient at once. You want milk. Do I? Or one performing the toddler Jedi mind trick with a finger twitch. I come here. An entreaty in your mouth, waiting for the other, me, to step through into the rippling mirror world and embrace you whole again. Things you'd rather not know, children show you in yourself. Viewed from earth, stars trace nervous loops. How time would crawl and race those early days, our worlds still so intertwined. Your face was mine, your head nodded into sleep, and my eyes closed. I thought I would read a couple of the ekphrastic poems that Brian mentioned. There are a few different sets of poems in this book that engage with objects as vessels of memory and transmission down the generations, I suppose. But I'd been wanting for a while to write, to find a way to write poems about Chinese ceramics, particularly the ones that were exported to the West, that were these sort of stylistic hybrids. You know, they were made in China but to a Western taste, because I guess I'd always felt a certain sympathy for them being a creature of mixed cultures myself. And I managed to find this dream commission at the World Museum in Liverpool, which is an institution that had actually been almost burned down in a great fire during the Blitz. So the museum facade, this neoclassical frontage to the building, is all that remains of the original building, and it's propped up by these steel girders of an entirely modern construction behind. And in this fire, all the provenance records of these objects were lost. And so I found myself sort of freed to imagine the histories and the travels of these objects by sea or along the Silk Road. And I guess I found an echo in them of the mysteries and dead ends of my own family history that I might talk about in a little bit. I thought I'd start with this, which is the first poem in the sequence, partly because it's the year of the horse. So the sequence as a whole is called In the Chinese Ceramics Gallery. Earthenware model of a horse, unglazed. I, too, am a survivor, my eroded coat dappled with lichen and stars. My spirited tail has long snapped off. 1 millennium and then another has wheeled on by, since the potter squatting on his dusty stool thumbed my jowls to the perfect roundness, a gesture tender despite his production line, and nicked my nostrils in this haughty flare. Stocky, they called me in the catalogue. I admit, though hollow, my belly's a swollen gourd, Buddha full. Ears pricked, mane brush stiff, my grin is quizzical, sometimes even a grimace behind the smudgy glass. My hooves were long buffed by clay ranks of imperial grooms. Reserved for only the finest tombs, my kind maps out the trade between civilizations, 1 squat stallion for 50 bales of silk. They rolled out the Silk Road before us, all the way to the walled city of Chang'an. The Han Emperor sent for us to fill his echoing stables. He called us his Tianma, celestial horses, expecting our hardy stock when the time came at last to carry him up the narrow passes into heaven. Some nights I dream of galloping across scrubby plains, the herds sweat tart as highland apricots around me, far blue peaks retreating into memory. And then I'll skip forward a bit in the sequence to a dish in blue and white in this style called crock, which was particularly prized by the Portuguese in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And you'll hear that these poems became a sort of slant way of thinking about migration and human stories of displacement and relocation and survival. And that subtext is maybe clearest in this poem, which actually takes that story of the museum's fire, destruction by fire, into itself. Thinly potted porcelain crock dish painted in underglaze blue. Is there a word for it in this new tongue? The class of ships the Portuguese named caravela and the French carack. Swift 3 or 4 masters, they were crack to the Dutch, whose guttural pitch I first heard from the sailors who loaded us up in our straw-stuffed crates. Porcelain vessels of diverse sorts, the manifest called us, stowed by the hundreds of thousands. Wares named for those stately ocean-going craft sailing homeward from the mythic east, freighted with silk and damask, barrels of oakum, quicksilver, cinnabar, camphor. Till disaster struck, wrecked off Goa's golden coast, as the cold current of decades flowed past us, my stacked brethren crusted with barnacles and powdery salt, mouths filling up with silt. Still, some of us continued to gleam like the shells that yawned at those depths. Dredged up from the dark, they pieced my fragments back to wholeness, masked each crack with filler and skill. At last I came to rest in this museum, a heavy Victorian vitrine whose subtly distorting glass recalled for me light filtering through underwater weeds. That night in the Blitz was my last near escape. Nothing like the kiln's clarifying flames. That fire was something else. Ranks of precious artifacts blasted into tinder, their cases smashed, rare specimens reduced to scattered feathers, shards of wired bone. In the aquarium, fish boiled in the tanks or swilled down drains. The model fishing boats went up in smoke. I've seen what it takes to cradle a wreck back into the light. Leaving the fractures for all to see, they rebuilt this place. From the other side of ruin, we found safe passage. I was saying to Brian, this book has been a challenging one to learn how to read from, partly because a lot of the poems in it are longer than I am used to write. And I think something about that was to do with a loosening in my style. I've almost felt like I had to learn again how to make poems from scratch after I had my children. And what I could stretch to was a lot messier than I'd found myself writing before, rangier. The poems sort of needed room to stretch their limbs. But it did mean that I felt a hankering sometimes after really short poems, and this is one of those. This is a poem that leaps off from that famous couple of lines of Emily Dickinson's, which you'll hear here. And I suppose it revisits my own childhood. After you have children, you find yourself revisiting at each age they reach, the age you were, and the parallels or differences. And that's, I guess, what I'm sort of doing here. Tell all the truth, but when my next slide clicks into place, tell it slant. It sets off an involuntary ricochet inside my head. Slant eyes, slant rhymes, slant. Still, I shan't tell about those playground jibes, jingles, fingers stretched to press lids taut, save how it taught me, still now, to press a lid, tell it slant, on anything like rage. I think women are expected not to be angry, aren't we? Particularly mothers. And speaking of revisiting earlier phases of life, this is a poem I found myself writing after visiting a friend I'd made at university. He still lived in Cambridge, the town where we'd been students together. This wasn't the last time I saw him, but I think we both had an inkling that there wouldn't be that many more visits, because he had been diagnosed with what wasn't clearly a terminal cancer at that point, but did prove to be. This poem is a sort of quizzical look back at our younger selves and the peculiar institution where we met, I suppose. There's a legend at Christ's College in Cambridge where we went, which is also the same college that Milton attended as an undergraduate, that Milton fell asleep under a mulberry tree in the gardens there, and that was where he was inspired to write his famous elegy, Lycidas. This legend is certainly not true. Eve's Dream. Last night I dreamt about the Fellows' Garden. I've not been back for maybe 15 years. Chagrined, I suppose, by the whiff of privilege. We'd broken in the way we sometimes did as undergrads, stumbling out of hall or bops. God, was that really what we called them? My friend would mastermind these antics. I won't say his name. I recently resolved never again to make a poem from another's pain. I can't remember if he'd pinch a key to the slender iron gate that's hidden round the eastern side, or did he somehow pick the lock? A rusty shriek, and he would cross the moonlit sill like Adam leaving paradise in reverse, brandishing a half-full bottle of red. I dreamt he led our drunken posse in a here we go round the mulberry tree. They called it Milton's mulberry, though who can really know? It's said the budding poet drifted off beneath its raft of unripe fruit, and when he woke, he wrote an elegy for a friend, a fellow student, dead too young. Or have I made it up, the bit about the nap? We all gripped hands and stumbled flushed around the spinning tree. Even at 19, I was such a square, a stickler, too anxious to derive pure joy from the rush of flouting rules. Of course, the porters must have known. Did they watch our greyish ghosts cavort across the monitor in the lodge and turn away like disappointed angels? I went to visit him at home soon after I first heard the news. It had been a while. These days he's still the same old jovial evangelical, but now I think he reads the Telegraph. I was shocked how thin he'd got, his yellowing skin. Chuckling, he asked if I would like to see his scar. I caught his little girl's expression as her daddy tented up his T-shirt, showing off the puckered ridge, stitches fresh, and an even slash that ran beneath his ribs. It's not just in my gut, that's the problem. Bouncing his boy from knee to knee, he winced. The toddler, oblivious to his father's pain, the way he hunched. Just then, I longed to prop him up somehow, like the stakes that lift the mulberry's exhausted boughs, sprawling from its grassy burial mound. A silhouette so frail it seemed a miracle each spring when at last it sprouted buds. The first draft of this had some awful line about the tree that let in suffering to the world. I can hardly bear to think about it now. When they sat down to eat, I made to leave, not wanting to outstay my mealy-mouthed excuse for dropping by, a cup of tea. No talk of death within a year or two. As we hugged goodbye, I thought his tired face betrayed a flicker of the teenage him. Lit-up grin, the one he wore those nights, the walled garden, spilling doubtful shadows, his one white shirt unbuttoned at the neck, black tie nonchalantly slung. His feet were bare and wet with dew in the slowly gathering light. Change of scene yet again. Though another poem of memory and unreliable narration to some extent. My first book, Loop of Jade, circled, I was about to say, looped, you could say, around my mum's abandonment as a baby in Guangdong province in 1948. But it didn't think much about the woman who adopted her, my adoptive grandmother, and the riddle, I suppose, of why she would have done such a thing, being always on the wrong side of the poverty line herself, including after she took my mum across the water to Hong Kong Island, still a British colony at that time. And so I found myself drawn to revisit her as a kind of enigma in this book. I mean, she wasn't really much of a mother to my mum, who was farmed out for long periods as a sort of indentured servant, I suppose, even as a small child to other families. She'd get by doing their laundry. That was how she earned her keep. Actually, one other thing that happened between the writing of Loop of Jade and this book was another piece in the puzzle, or another red herring, a piece of information my mum passed on to me, which was that my adoptive grandmother had herself been sold as a little girl by her family, probably at a time of scarcity, which is a practice that is recorded down centuries of Chinese history, but I suppose was still happening in the 20th century. Maybe one can hope less so now. And And so I wrote this poem that has these slashes in it to mark sort of irreconcilable alternatives where I can't pin down the historical record, and there is, of course, no archive that I could turn to that would settle these questions. It's also a specular, that sort of looping form where the syntax spools one way and then another, invented by the wonderful poet Eliot Prize. But I was intrigued to discover that there is actually a Chinese form of a mirror poem that works in quite a similar way. This is called Foremother, and it has an epigraph from one of the most famous of classical Chinese novels, The Dream of the Red Chamber. Truth becomes fiction when the fiction's true. Real becomes not real when the unreal's real. Foremother. What I know begins outside, within the limits of Shanghai. A girl is born, youngest of many. One day, if it helps say the bowls are empty, the girl is sold to strangers. If it helps say it sounds like a fairy tale. Did you see the look in her mother's eyes? This is what happens, then, now, where money buys desire, silence. If it helps, say her mother was dead. What she went on to live, what she became, you can imagine. Imagine, can you, what she went on to live? What she became, if it helps, say. Her mother was dead desire, silence. Where money buys then, now, this is. What happened, happens. Did you see? The look in her mother's eyes, if it helps, say it sounds like a fairy tale. Sold to strangers. The girl is, if it helps. Say the bowls are empty. One day, a girl is born, youngest of many. The limits of Shanghai, outside, within, what I know begins. And then I think I'll end by reading a few segments from this sprawling, long poem in 23 sections that ends the book, which is a poem that I very nearly did not write. The book was finished, I thought, before I wrote this poem, which is about my adoptive grandmother. And in some ways, I really didn't want to write this poem, but I guess that's often where the most vital work comes from, isn't it? From the place you don't want to go. I probably don't need to tell you too much of the background because it's narrated within the poem itself, but suffice to say, I was flicking through some family photo albums one day, and I came across a picture of my mum and her adoptive mother, and I suddenly had this intuition that there was no way that they were not biologically related because they looked so much like each other in this photograph. That's an impression that I don't know what its basis in fact or truth or reliability is. I've looked back at the photograph subsequent times and not had the same feeling at all. But I guess I felt opening up underneath me this sort of trapdoor into an alternate history. And this is what this poem explores. I'm just going to read some of the more personal autobiographical parts, I suppose, though there are lots of different elements in it. including one strand that thinks about Boix, and in particular his story, The Garden of Forking Paths, which was an early exploration of this idea we now are used to calling the multiverse, I suppose. And also another long shaggy dog story about a sinologist in Cambridge who was trying to rediscover a lost form of Chinese music. So you see that there's ideas of things that are lost or seem to be lost that actually maybe were there all along, hiding in plain sight. So I'll read a few of these. Oh, there's an epigraph. The title, An Error, a Ghost, comes from that Boix story, as does this epigraph. I imagined a labyrinth of labyrinths, a maze of mazes, a twisting, turning, ever-widening labyrinth that contained both past and future and somehow implied the stars. 1. I turned the page and knew I'd seen the photograph before. I was looking for my dad after he died, but this album was older, hers. I'd seen the same picture, still I'd not seen it. Was startled to my core. 3. I've been putting this off, don't want to turn to it again. In grainy black and white, a portrait of my mum. Her face rhymes with mine at 5, my daughter's now. Sat next to the woman she was taught to call mother. They've put on their best, girl in a pale striped dress, Peter Pan collar, pigtails tied with ribbons that look white, but can't be. The woman, she's in a patterned Chung psalm out of Wong Kar-wai, lipstick, wavy hair restrained into a do. Both smile. The child's gaze blurs subtly, caught by something out of frame. Hers looks straight into the lens. What shocked me? Their noses. Surely they were the same, or nearly. But more than that, the contours of her face. 6. That nose. I'd struggled to draw it in art class, scanning the propped mirror's smeary glass to produce the lifeless self-portrait my teacher called, a bit racist this, or just perceptive, a mask. I felt myself being driven in the dark along another history's forking path, a shift in the terms of the universe, undoing, if true, everything I knew about our dim scene of origin. Gravity and quantum overlaid, 2 divergent worlds. 15. The end is sown before the beginning, between 2 mirrors, mise en abîme. The egg that grew into my daughter formed within me, her mother, while my body formed within the body of her grandmother, and so on back. Down time's corridor, its unopened door, the ghost won't answer. How much must you hate yourself to tell your child she's not your own? This next section is all true. I dug up an embarrassing poem I'd written as a teenager, another of those parasitic pseudo-memories that seemed to have pushed out of view any actual memory I had of meeting my grandmother as a small child. 16. I did meet her at least once. My mum took us when we still lived in Hong Kong. Nothing of that day remains for me, save the red drum she gave my brother, the kind with a stem rolled between two palms, flailing beads on strings to frighten away spirits of ill intent. A phrase from a failed poem by a much earlier me. I dug it up, but found it's better lost, trying to decipher the riddle of her. Plus ça change, though now I'd run a mile from Lotus Pale. The bad teenage poem has displaced any real memory of her I might have had. Was there, in fact, a tenemented grime-barred window, or was that overwritten detail a stab at verisimilitude? I think I did once ask my mum her name. Ask again, and this time write it down. For memory turns opaque, foams to sea glass, or the nascent cataracts my mum had cut out, milky discs of jade. Passed down from generation to generation of my hard drives, miraculous survival, that terrible draft is now reinterred in a subfolder on the cloud. A creature of bits, it will outlast us all, or till the lights go out. And in this last section I'll read, I look at the photograph again, and the likeness has disappeared. 20. Of the photograph, I took a furtive snap. I open up the app, look at it again. Her face, a garden I can take in only in parts, no long view, boundaries occluded, bends where the way disappears. This time, I'm not sure. A phantom resemblance, a magic eye picture. Now you see it, now you don't. A shadow, a wrong laddering down into my blood, or not. If every family is a kind of story, however broken, a stone passed through many lives, what would it mean to find the truth? Pity those who make their mothers into myths. For them is reserved a special hell. More pitiable still, and overlapping, are the others, the ones who must make their myths into mothers. Thank you very much for listening.
That was amazing. Thank you, Sarah. So for now, I think any questions that you have from the reading or about the poetry scene generally, just in your experience as a poetry editor. I know we've been speaking about that earlier today. But I just wanted to return to what you were speaking in terms of motherhood and returning to poetry and how you felt like you had to almost relearn a language at a time when your children were learning languages and making fun kind of missteps and miscategorizations or productive ones. And I wanted to ask about that process of returning to poetry. And I mean, you experiment so lovely, have some lovely examples of form where you're experimenting with contrapuntal and erasure and prose poetry, and the form of For Mother as well that you read at the end there. Was form a way to kind of reclaim poetry for you, or to return to it? Or how did that process kind of materialize?
I think it was. In relearning from scratch, form could become almost like a, what do you call those, walker? Yeah, a walker, like children hang on to as they're learning to take their first steps. I sort of found comfort in finding pre-existing architectures that would give some sort of shape to what I was trying to do. And I suppose that turned later into inventing new forms that would be able to take up part of the mantle of what I was trying to express in a poem through their very shape and the way that they would sort of pace and embody a thought. I guess that's why these contrapuntal mirroring, looping in some way forms became so important to this book, which is about sort of cycles of history and trauma and wanting to escape them in some sense.
Fantastic. So in addition to being a poet, you're also, of course, poetry editor of Chatto Windus, a role you took on 3 years ago. And originally, your first collection, Loop of Jade, was published with Chatto as well. I wanted to ask you, could you tell us about your journey from as a poet and as a teacher to the editing world, and if there's anything that surprised you along the way?
Oh my goodness, I had no idea what it takes to make a book. So I was hugely surprised and humbled, actually, by the huge numbers of people in an outfit like Chatto, and in different ways across presses through the spectrum, including down to one-man bands where editors might be wearing the hat of editor and publicist and marketer and designer, so many different intelligences and hands touch a book. I was astonished by by that, and also by the way that you have to keep pitching and repitching a book as an editor internally within a house like Chatto or Penguin. And every time you re-explain what the book is and what its significance and delights and work in the world are, you learn something more about it. And so there is a wisdom, actually, to sort of first presenting it to one set of colleagues and then the editorial team and then the marketing team and then the sales team who will speak to bookshops. That every time through that process, which can take up to a year, you're coming to understand the book better and better. And it's at the towards the end of that path that you come to write the cover copy, as we were talking about in class this morning. And by that stage, you have a sense of how to crystallize in 100 words what a book is doing, which is an art that I never appreciated before and now realize is really key, because if as an editor you do that well, it translates the book for its readers and you find it echoed in reviews, echoed in the sense of what people think a book is doing, and you can open up a work for the world. I'm not sure I've always got it right. I'm still learning. But I hope to get ever better.
Do you have a favorite part of that process, from kind of initially finding a project or a person and making that initial connection? You mentioned earlier about poets' living room tables and kitchen tables and having those conversations. Do you have a favorite process, or part in the process as a book goes from that idea to, the various pitching that you have to do to finally having it in the world?
I think my favorite part, I love all of it, really. I love every conversation I have with my poets, and the immense privilege of being around that kitchen table with a cup of tea when somebody's, sketching their first tentative ideas for a collection and where it might go, and then it takes all sorts of twists and turns after that point. But being there at the outset is a very special thing. But I think my favourite part of all is the point when the poems are pretty much there. There might be some gaps still to fill, but it's not really clear until you lay it all out. And sort of thinking about the structure of a book at that point, and how that structure can work to bring out the various through lines to best advantage and make it feel like a satisfying, integrated whole, even if it's quite a miscellaneous collection. I find that really thrilling, actually, and amazing how you feel it sort of click into place when it's finally right, that it's all vibrating and, you know, doing what it needs to do.
Do you feel like there's ever moments in those conversations where your poets are like, oh, I didn't realize that, or I didn't see that, where you kind of give them kind of a different, bigger picture, or a zooming out from their perspective and finding associations and echoes?
Absolutely, and I have had this poet so many times myself. I've had this experience so many times myself as a poet that I find it somewhat miraculous, actually, the state of unknowing that we have to cultivate in order for these poems to fall out of us at all. And so that process of bringing everything that you've been doing all along into consciousness is quite a strange one and happens surprisingly late, I guess. But it is, of course, the job of the editor to be a few steps ahead on that path, and almost giving back, reflecting back to the poet what it is that they've done or what they were trying to do and what the book could be in its perfect form. So, yes, I think that's maybe the most important part of the job, to be an interpreter of the work, but with the mirror, with the glass tilted in such a way that you're giving it back to the poet in its perfected form, as it were.
That's great. Did you find that your experience as a poet and kind of going through the editorial process yourself, did it give you any sense of, you know, qualities of an ideal editor that you wanted? I know earlier you said that different poets want different things. Some want to be kind of left alone, stay away, do not, you know, don't bother me, while others really need that kind of regular check-in and support. Were you at any point thinking, you know, what is my ideal editor like, and can I embody that? Or how did you find yourself kind of shaping your editorial identity, as it were?
Oh, I've been very lucky in the editors I've had. First and foremost being Parissa Ebrahimi, who used to do my job at Chatto, and really made that list what it was. She was a visionary in lots of ways, actually. But now that we've worked on 2 books together, because Parissa still edits me, even from her new position in Penguin in New York, while I look after the other poets, it was quite moving to me in some ways how our relationship had shifted and changed from first book to second book, that we have a sort of shorthand, a way of understanding each other now, that I think helps me to see the value of that poet-editor relationship being a long-term game. That, well, and even if it's not, even if you're like me being parachuted in to take over a list, it's incumbent upon the editor not just to see the book in front of them, but to have known everything that poet has done through the whole of their writing life. And that is part of my preparation, because I don't think that, how could I approach a poet like Ruth Bedell if I hadn't read, you know, her dozens of poetry collections prior to the one we worked on together. So, but yes, there is an understanding that develops and a trust too, both ways. That, yeah, you know, on each side when to push something for something when it's really important, and when to give in. And that push-pull, I think, is a vital part of the relationship. It has to be reciprocal and a discussion. I think of the poet-author, the editor-author relationship as sort of on the one hand, one of love, really. You have to be a champion and an advocate for the writer in the world, and you have to be ready to support them in whatever they're going to do. But I'm going to mangle the quote, which I can't quite remember, but Toni Morrison, consummate editor, and I try to learn from her example as much as I can, said that you can't love your authors. Like you have to be hard with them. So it's love, but also not love. You have to approach the work cold, and not give it any indulgence at the same time as absolutely loving it.
I mean, that sounds like a delicate balance to learn, and to learn quite quickly on the job. Do you have any examples that you'd feel comfortable sharing of, working with a particular poet where, you had an impact, kind of seeing the work through to its fulfillment, or, having to push back or having to allow?
Gosh, I'm trying to think what the most interesting, instructive examples of this would be. Okay, well, so as not to break any confidences, maybe I should use one where I'm the poet in the scenario rather than the editor. But I think a really important example of that for me was to do with a sequence of poems that appeared in my first book, Loop of Jade, which I'd a sequence of poems based on a fantastical encyclopedia of animals, a Chinese encyclopedia invented by Boix. And I'd always envisaged that sequence sitting together in the middle of the book. I couldn't imagine it otherwise. When Parissa read the manuscript, she felt that block was messing up the rhythm of the book entirely, and she wanted to totally sever them from one another so that they weren't actually part of a sequence anymore, the poems, which I went... and couldn't go there. But then over weeks we developed this compromise whereby the poems, we did split them up and scatter them over across the book like a sort of spine, but they were still part of the sequence. And I think that discussion, that antagonism, that compromise made a much, much stronger book that neither of us would have independently envisaged. Without the tussle, so yeah, I take that as a instance of why not to be afraid of what you could call conflict in the author-editor relationship. That, I would imagine, most of the time it results in a better book.
Excellent. I'll ask one more, and then I'll stop hogging the microphone. I guess from your vantage point as a poet and as a poetry editor, we talked earlier about how you were very active and kind of always kind of keeping an ear out for new talent and new voices, and going to readings whenever childcare demands allow, and always flipping through journals, always being active in that community. I'm wondering, is there something that you want, that you feel like is missing from the UK poetry scene, that you would love to see represented?
That's such a good question, Brian. I don't know if I know the answer to that. Well, because I don't want to prejudge, really. I feel like I need to meet every new manuscript that comes in with fresh eyes, because that book is the author's book, not my book, and its path is its own path to travel. An editor is only ever a guide. And so I feel like it's sort of a contradiction in terms for an editor to wish a particular book into existence. But I suppose editors and agents do have their wish lists, don't they, where they describe their taste. I could could offer a picture of what I am most excited about. Though I haven't yet really written one myself, I'm quite interested in the space of the project book that has some sort of ambition and bigger architecture and conceptual arc to it. But then I also am sort of in love with a quite old-fashioned model of poetry book that just, you know, bangs together the best things that a poet's written. So I feel like every sort of rule I give or pointer is going to have its counter, which is probably the way that things should be.
Any questions? All right, while you're thinking. Yes, Anita, yes.
You talked about using form kind of as a marker during this long period that you've been building the second collection. Is it more like to warm yourself up, or like you said, almost like relearning, or is it just that, you know, for each of the poem that ended up in this collection, you tested a lot of different forms for them specifically? So I don't know if that's a clear question, but I was wondering like how you're using form to help you in the different ways.
So I'll just quickly repeat that for the people joining us online. So Anita's question was, you know, I love the reference to like using form as a walker, and was that for kind of having a model to kind of reclaim a voice, or to kind of explore that? How did that work for you?
I mean, there were some poems that took a lot of labouring and tinkering over. I guess one example would be the sort of, you could call them double acrostic poems of the DNA sequence that sort of quite literally interweaves the code pair bases of a certain strand of the human genome at each end of the line. But even that there's a freeingness to that sort of mechanical work, that it keeps the conscious brain ticking over and occupied while other energies can start to emerge, which I guess is the ideal for form, isn't it? That it feels like a force coming from outside you, but it's actually inside you. And I've never experienced that sort of uncanny sense of my hand being directed from outside so acutely as when I wrote that specular poem called Foremother, which was almost in this sort of trance state, actually. It happened really fast, that I'd been struggling to write this poem because of the problem of too much backstory, how to make it clear, how to convey all of this information, as it were. And so I started to make these jottings, including that refrain, that if it helps. And then by the time I'd slogged my way through, I don't know, whatever, 12 or so lines, I suddenly had this intuition. Could this be a specular? If I turn the phrases around the other way, will it work? And it almost entirely worked. I had to do a bit of reshaping on both sides of the mirror, but it felt like it fell out of the sky, actually. And I guess that's the ideal, that form is a way of levering something out of you that needed to come out. Thank you, really good question.
When you were speaking about how you had to incorporate some of the messiness into your process, like motherhood and childhood, I was just wondering, how then did you as a poet feel when you knew something was finished, you know, and how you intuited that, and then as an editor, how you know something's finished, and if there's a difference between the two?
So it's a fantastic question about the kind of the messiness of the process and how you know when it's finished.
I think that they're undoubtedly related. And it's not invariably the case that poetry editors are poets. I mean, Parissa, my own editor, is not, and she is one of the most brilliant editorial minds I've encountered, so it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand, but I think it makes it easier to understand the experience and what it feels like for the poem to click shut. It's something that I used to struggle with, and maybe also speaks to the 10-year gap between my books, that I wrote most of Loop of Jade in a very caring, important to me workshop of trusted friends, actually one of whom is here today. And I really missed that after I was no longer sort of regularly part of it. And I sort of felt this panic that how can I know what to do with the poem, and et cetera, et cetera. But then I found myself as the years went by, developing a sort of instinct and a confidence that actually in the end it was fine. And maybe that's the path of growth that all writers take, that eventually you just understand when something of yours is done and how it needs to be. I think maybe my most helpful contribution I make with my poets on this front is what to cut. I think that is often clearer to a fresh pair of eyes. And sometimes, I mean, very often, what the poem needs en route to its finishing is to sort of sculpting, like a Michelangelo, you know, like taking the excess stone away sort of thing. I mean, there are all sorts of ways and paths and heuristics, but that is one thing I find myself doing quite a lot as an editor. Like when it's a business of adding more, my suggestions I find are almost never as good as if I just said need some more. You know, like leave the poet to come up with the solution themselves.
Yeah. So have you always been into poetry, and how did you find yourself attracted to poetry?
I mean, despite having read a poem about embarrassing teenage juvenilia, I actually was not one of those people that wrote from very early or very passionately as a child or anything. I wrote a handful of poems as a teenager, partly because I had fallen so much in love with the exercise at school of close reading poems. So that was the thing I fell in love with first. And including when I started later in school to encounter things like, it's often proofrock, isn't it? Like the turning point poets cite. For me, it was actually proofrock, but also a John Ashbery poem that I found because an epigraph to one of the Philip Pullman, his Dark Materials book, the last in the trilogy. That epigraph is from a John Ashbery poem called The Ecclesiast, which I looked up and I thought, wow, what a weird, wonderful thing this is. How on earth does this work? And so, yeah, it was the sort of enchantment of that process. It took many years for me to learn how to write poems myself. And in my undergraduate English literature degree was in some ways positively unhelpful to that process. It wasn't until my sort of, I was like 23, 24 that it finally clicked. And that was only after I went to study as a graduate student for a year in the States, and I took a creative writing workshop with an American poet called Jory Graham. And if I were to sum up what I learnt from working with her for a year, it was switch off your brain, Sarah, and just try and feel and experience the things. And then that was really, really the advice I needed, because too much brain was happening in my early attempts, which were, oh my goodness, so bad.
How would you like to take in poetry? Would you like to read it on the page, or have someone read it to you? Is there a place or time of day? What enhances poetry?
I have an armchair in the corner of our lounge, which is super comfy, and that's my favourite chair to sit in for reading poetry. I guess these days I, of necessity, read quite a lot on the screen, but I don't think that's the best way. I think in lovely textured print is the optimal. But actually, I love the poetry reading as an embodied form. Like it has a kinship with theatre, doesn't it? In as much as, I mean, I do attend quite a lot of readings on Zoom, but I think that even though you can hear the poet perhaps more clearly and certainly see their face more clearly, something is lost in the translation to light and bits. I just love, as an audience member, the magic of being at a poetry reading, even though actually I don't think I'm very good at processing the information of a poem in a reading necessarily. But something opens up that's about more than what is the poem saying. So even if you're not sort of quite taking in line to line in the way that you would on the page through successive rereadings, you're experiencing some other truth of the reality of the poem. And I just find it intoxicating. If I could go to a poetry reading every night, I would.
I'm curious, when you're putting together poetry collections, whether you sort of know what you want to write about, or like what themes you want the collection to explore before you start writing, or whether you're sort of writing a bit and then the themes start to emerge, or sort of which comes first perhaps, or whether it's like more of a combined process.
I think this varies dramatically from poet to poet and book to book, doesn't it? But the book I've just finished, Four Tokens, was quite an extreme example of having no clue what was going on until very late in the process. And actually, I think that sort of became one of the themes of the book, that for years I'd sort of thought, oh, these poems are so miscellaneous, they don't hang together, it's not satisfying as a book. I would need to start again with a purpose and an idea. I mean, there were resonances, like strands of poems about the children and so on, but it still didn't feel like it was hanging together. And then in the last weeks of writing the book, I sort of had this idea that, this idea of mess and noise and randomness and having to sort of listen for the signal in the noise and the static. And I'm very susceptible to a kind of art which happens in something like a poem like Jory Graham's Dream of the Unified Field, which is a multi-part poem. Also some films like that tell their story out of chronology, or novels that work in a similar way. I find it very moving, that experience of what seems like random fragments suddenly swimming into focus, you know. And I guess I wanted there to be something of that experience in reading this collection, so it sort of became part of it, this tension between mess and form and nonsense and meaning. I have a long-standing ambition, though, to write a sustained know what you're doing when you start project book, and I would like to do that for my next collection if I can possibly come up with an idea, which I do not have. So if somebody wants to tell me what to do, I'll gladly take the direction.
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes.
I have a question about editing your own poems. How do you start? Like, how do you identify what needs editing, and when do you stop, or do you stop doing?
I guess just coming back for successive sweeps, that you do a bit of tinkering and it feels better, or you over-tinker and then it feels worse. And so I have this sort of almost OCD-ish way of tracking the evolution of a poem. So I like a sort of tick, I'll periodically copy and paste the entire poem onto the next page beneath it in the Word doc. So there's this sort of comet tail going back in time of the poem's progression. And that's because I'm so worried about overworking the poem and not being able to take it back in time to the place where it still worked. Because I recognise that one of my problems is over-neatness. Which is why I guess I talk with fascination about mess. I had a very interesting conversation with Jeff Schatz, the editor-in-chief at Grey Wolf in the States, about working together on Danez Smith's last book, wonderful African-American poet. Their collection, Bluff, was very concerned with the Black Lives Matter protests as a very sprawling, uncontainable kind of a book full of lots of moving parts. And what Jeff said to me was that he found it important not to overwork those poems as an editor, because there was some sort of principle in them whereby the uncontainableness. In short, I think he was saying that to over-edit those poems would be like policing them, that there was a political metaphor there happening between containment and freedom. And that has stayed with me, this idea of you don't want to over-police the poem or the poet's imagination. Sorry, that was a bit of a sidetrack from your question, but hopefully does speak to it.
Fantastic. Well, if you have any more questions, you're very welcome to pose them at the table in the back where Sarah will be selling copies of 4 tokens. And I highly encourage you, pick up a copy. But thank you very much for joining, and thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone. Do
Great.
come and chat. Thank you, bye.